I'm making this video to document the history of my great-great-grandfather, George Washington Bland. Now, he's also referred to as G.W. Bland in a number of historical records. He was born September 14, 1831, and died October 7, 1905. He was a Southern combat soldier that fought in the Confederate Army and was a member of the 20th Arkansas Infantry Regiment, a unit that was formed during 1861 and then disbanded in 1865 following the defeat of the South by the Union. Actually, Granddad's military units were renamed and redesignated several times, and I'll try to point that out as we go along. As a side note, the background that you're seeing behind me was taken from an old silent movie made around 1920s. The movie starred Buster Keaton and is in the public domain, meaning it's not under copyright. I edited the film to focus on the visual aspect of what things may have looked like in the mid-1800s. Trains, building, clothes, hats, bonnets, aprons, dirt streets, and so forth, just to add a little bit of this visual interest. The movie was entitled The General, which was the name of a steam train, and the engineer was Buster Keaton. I've taken most of the scenes of Buster out, just leaving the background scenes. During the Civil War, G.W. was initially appointed as a corporal, although he may have entered as a private and just been promoted. And upon disbandment of the Confederate Army, he was at the rank of sergeant. Now, he was in Company E of the 22nd Army Infantry that was initially formed as a group of volunteers. I found references that they were known as the Hempstead Plowboys, which I guess relates to Hempstead County, but that's really not where he was from. G.W.'s commanding officer was a captain named Cottingham, and Company E itself was actually organized in Arkansas on March the 1st, 1862. Great-Granddaddy G.W.'s infantry regiment was initially ordered to move east of the Mississippi River, along with General Earl Van Dorn's Confederate Army element that was stationed further to the west. The regiment was added to a brigade command by Brigadier General Albert Rust, spelled R-U-S-T. Now, Great-Granddad and his fellow Confederate soldiers boarded a steamboat at Des Arc, Arkansas, and moved down the White River until they got to its mouth. Then they moved out and up the Mississippi River, finally landing at Memphis, Tennessee, and that was on April the 11th, 1862. The Confederate regiment, along with G.W., was immediately ordered with the remainder of Rust's brigade to a military installation named Fort Pillow, P-I-L-L-O-W, which was located about 50 miles north of Memphis. Company E departed Memphis the very next day by steamboat, and on April the 12th, 1862, they were in arrival at Fort Pillow by the 13th. It was during the bombardment of Fort Pillow that soldiers of Colonel King's regiment and Grandpa G.W. saw their first combat with the Union Army. G.W. and his men remained at Fort Pillow for only 14 days. They didn't experience many casualties from the Union bombardment of the fort, but a lot of the Confederate soldiers became sick and several died due to the very muddy, cold, and wet conditions, as well as the poor drinking water supply at the fort. After 2 weeks of cannon bombardment, Sergeant Bland and his rebel comrades were ordered out of Fort Pillow. And on April the 26th, 1862, the Confederate troops moved back to Memphis. but they only got to rest for a few days until GW's unit left Memphis for Corinth, Mississippi. That movement taking place on May 1st, 1862. In late April and early May of 1862, the Confederate Army as a whole underwent an Army-wide reorganization due to the passage of something called the Conscription Act, the draft. The draft at that time said all 12-month volunteer regiments had to remuster and re-enlist for 2 additional years or for the duration of the war. So they were no longer volunteers. New officers were selected and ordered into command positions, and men who happened to be exempted from service by virtue of age or some other reasons that were listed under the Conscription Act were allowed to take a discharge and go home. Officers who did not stand for reassignment were offered a discharge. The Confederate Army reorganization was accomplished among all Arkansas regiments, those in and around Corinth, Mississippi, following the Battle of Shiloh. The Arkansas 22nd Infantry was reorganized at Corinth, Mississippi on May 8th and redesignated as the 20th Arkansas Infantry. It was later, during the Lucca-Corinth campaign, that the 20th Arkansas Infantry Group was assigned to Brigadier General William L. Cabell's brigade, and that was under Brigadier General Dabney Murray's division, which was within the Major General Price's corps of the Confederate Army of the West. The regiment saw fighting during the battles of Farmington, 2nd Corinth, and Coffeyville, Mississippi. Following the Corinth, Mississippi campaign, George W. Bland's Arkansas Confederate Regiment was reassigned to General Martin E. Greene's brigade in the Confederate Army of Mississippi, under the Department of Mississippi and East Louisiana. So now you're beginning to see what I mean about his units being changed up. Part of Greene's brigade, including many from the 20th Arkansas Infantry, were captured, and Major Robinson was killed in the Battle of Big Black in the rear of the Battle of Vicksburg, Mississippi on May 17, 1863. Remnants of the Confederate regiment then fell back inside the Vicksburg defensive trench works and endured a 40-plus day siege of Vicksburg. I've been there and walked in some of those trenches, and it's quite something to see. They still exist by the Park Service. Prisoners from the Arkansas 20th who were captured at the Battle of Big Black were sent to prison camps in the north and eventually exchanged at City Point, Virginia during December of 1863. Presently, I don't know if Grandpa George was among this group, although I'm pretty sure documentation exists as to whether or not he was captured among that group. I just haven't located those documents yet. The remainder of the Confederate regiment surrendered, along with the Confederate Army of Mississippi, at the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi on July the 4th, 1863. Now, General U.S. Grant initially demanded an unconditional surrender of the Vicksburg garrison, but he relented and he faced the necessity of feeding a captured 30,000 starving Confederate soldiers, and he had the idea that if he just released these soldiers, he might do more harm to the Confederate cause by just releasing them to return home, rather than keeping them as prisoners, feeding them, and so on, and exchanging them as whole units. So U.S. Grant ordered a conditional surrender and allowed the immediate parole of the captured Confederate soldiers. So on July the 11th, 1863, thousands of able-bodied Confederate prisoners were simply allowed to walk out of Vicksburg without weapons, of course, and they weren't allowed to proceed in any kind of military formation. They had to straggle about and leave as individuals. Paroling of these able-bodied men was completed in their respective regimental camps inside Vicksburg prior to July the 11th. Some soldiers from the 15th Northwest Arkansas Group were paroled on July 8th and 9th of 1863. Now, those soldiers of the Confederacy that were wounded or sick or in various hospitals in Vicksburg were paroled and were released just as soon as they could leave on their own. Some of the more seriously wounded and sick were sent by steamship down the Mississippi River and over to Mobile, Alabama, where they were delivered to Confederate authorities. Now, the Confederates saw this as a great thing because they needed to organize these men, and they hurriedly designated a location of Enterprise, Mississippi, as a rendezvous point for releasing and reorganizing these Vicksburg parolees. But the just released Confederate soldiers, although they were supposed to report to the rendezvous point after they cleared the last federal control point at Big Black Bridge, you got to realize there were no communication lines during that time, and it was just impossible to pass this information to those just released Confederate soldiers. And most of the Arkansas units simply bypassed those quickly established rendezvous camps, and with probably the help and direction of their Union captors, simply crossed the Mississippi River and returned to their homes in Arkansas. Well, finally, Confederate Major General Pemberton requested that Confederate President Jefferson Davis grant these men a 30 to 60-day furlough, which was certainly better than the choice of declaring the men to be deserters and searching them out and having them shot or hanged. Furloughs were not strictly enforced in terms of time, so long as the soldier eventually showed up at parole camps to be declared exchanged and to be returned to duty. Major General Pemberton eventually coordinated with the Confederate War Department and Confederate General Kirby Smith, who was commanding the Department of the Trans-Mississippi, had the Arkansas-Vicksburg parolees rendezvous point eventually established at Camden, Arkansas. When the soldiers were finally exchanged, reorganized, they were mounted at Washington, Arkansas in the fall of 1863, and men of the Arkansas 20th Infantry were attached to Dockery's brigade in the Trans-Mississippi Department. During this period, the Arkansas State Military Board officially redesignated the regiment as the 41st Arkansas Infantry Regiment, mounted. But this redesignation was generally ignored by the unit and its commander, and the unit as well, because it was still often referred to as the 20th Arkansas Infantry. Those once Confederate prisoners became combat soldiers again, participating in the Camden expedition in March and April of 1864. The Arkansas men saw combat in skirmishes on the Little Missouri, on the Prairie du Chien, and at the battles of Mark's Mill and Jenkins Ferry in April 1864. And during Price's Missouri raid, took part in the battles of Pilot Knob, Boonville, Independence, and during September and October of 1864, they were involved in other skirmishes. During November of 1864, remnants of Johnson's Confederate 15th Arkansas, Dockery's 19th Arkansas, and the 20th Arkansas Infantry regiments were combined to form the 3rd Arkansas Consolidated Infantry Regiment. The 3rd Arkansas Consolidated Infantry Regiment was surrendered with General Kirby Smith's Department of the Trans-Mississippi on May 26, 1865. When the Trans-Mississippi Department surrendered, all of the Arkansas infantry regiments were encamped in and around Marshall, Texas. The records indicated a war-ravaged Arkansas was no longer able to provide adequate sustenance and food to the Army. The regiments were eventually ordered to Shreveport, Louisiana to be paroled, but none of them did so. Some soldiers, however, did go to Shreveport on their own to be paroled, but mostly men of the Confederate regiments simply disbanded without formally surrendering. So Angie Bland Davis, Anita Bland Smithy, Mike Bland, and children and grandchildren of Annie Frances Bland, Newman Redding. This is the Civil War story of my great-great-grandfather, Confederate Army Sergeant George Washington Bland. Each of you will have to figure out how many greats to put in front of the word grandfather when referring to your own relationship with GW. Ella and Roman, who are my grandchildren, this is the story of your great-great-great-great-grandfather. Let me tell you just a little bit more about your Civil War soldier, great-granddaddy, and then we'll be done. George W.'s mother and father, my paternal great-great-great-grandparents, were both born in North Carolina, but later moved to Tennessee, and that is where GW was born. GW's wife, Margaret Bland, was born August the 28th in 1835. In some cases, the records spell her name Margarett. However, her headstone indicated a spelling of Margrett. Margaret's first child, John Bland, was born in Arkansas during 1861, when Margaret was approximately 26 years of age and GW was going into the Confederate Army. Census records listed her occupation as housekeeping. Like GW's parents, Margaret's parents were both born in North Carolina, which was also Margaret's birthplace. She was born during 1835 and lived to age 89, having died January the 4th, 1925. She is buried at Sylvania Cemetery in Lonoke County, Arkansas, also the location of GW's internment. Together, George W. and Margaret Bland had 4 sons and 3 daughters. All of the children were born in Arkansas, presumably in Lonoke County and in Butlerville. The children's names and birth dates will be provided in the following, and this is data that I took from the 1880 census records, National Census records. Their first son was named John, and he was born in 1861, as I've already said. He died in 1953 at the age of 92 when I was 3 years old. John was married to Lou Bland, L-U-E. She lived from 1866 to 1935. Both are now buried in Butlerville, Cemetery, which is also named Greenwood Baptist Cemetery in Lonoke County, Arkansas. Now, great-great-grandma Margaret was 26 years old when her first child, John Jr., was born. Now, her second child was Thomas J. Bland, and he was born in 1864, 1865. However, his headstone indicates 1868, which I think is wrong. Thomas J. was my grandfather's dad. My grandfather being Richard Harrison Bland, my dad's father. My dad being Alfred O'Neill Bland. By the way, the J in Thomas J. Bland's name was for Jefferson. So George Washington Bland had a son also named after one of our country's founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson Bland. It seems that admiration for America's founding fathers ran deep in the Bland family. Now, their third child was Joyce, J-O-I-C-E, middle initial E. Bland. She was born in 1866. I'm not sure of the exact date. Their fourth child was George G. Bland. He was born in 1870, or about then. They also called him Gigi, or that's how he signed his name to some documents. He married Dolly Bland, and she lived from August of 1875 to March of 1913. G.W. and Margaret's next born child, their fifth, was Rachel Bland, who was born about 1872. And in 1874, another girl came to join the family named Tennessee. Tennessee Bland. Thought that was an interesting name. Now, their seventh and last child was Charles Bland, and he was born November the 7th, or 17th, in 1877, and he died November 13th, 1956, at the age of 79, when I was 6 years old. Charles was married to Ellie Bland, a lady that lived from September 22nd, 1886 to December of 1973. They are also interred at Sylvania Cemetery. Because all of George W. and Margaret's children were born in Arkansas, we can easily conclude that the G.W. Bland family was in residence in Lonoke County, Arkansas, as early as 1860 to 1861, and probably quite a bit earlier. In the 1880 National Census, former Confederate soldier G.W. was 48 years old, still living in Lonoke County, Arkansas with his family, still residents of Butler Township. G.W. was listed as a farmer. Thomas Jefferson Bland, my great-grandfather, was the father of Richard Harrison Bland, my grandfather. Also appears to be that he was named after a President Harrison, I suppose. It is clear then that the Bland family ancestors were pioneer residents of Lonoke County, Butlerville, Arkansas, even before the outbreak of the Civil War. And if you were to come across any conflicting documentation, please do contact me about it. My email address is BlackBearSix, BlackBearsix, no spaces, at gmail.com. My name is Lester Bland. I live in Bella Vista, Arkansas, and this is July the 16th, 2019.